Otimoi, acknowledgement to the Babongo First Nations people of Gabon, our village Mboka Njambe, which translates to God's universal village, and His Majesty, my spiritual father, and our King, King Adamangana. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge all of the Indigenous First Nations people of the world, starting with the Costa Rican groups, Bree in particular, who we're strongly associated with, and then furthermore, the entire world today. And this is the nature of the conversation I'm going to have, which is to extend along a common theme to us through these videos and also our discussions with patients that we serve and people that we interact with through Indigenous connections. So where we're coming from today has been inspired by recent events that have transpired with our connections, and a reminder of what we're facing with the two psychologies that are existing when we're contacting Indigenous peoples and looking for what would be authenticity. Now, the Western psychology, to start, couldn't be further from what is authentic Indigenous psychology. Now, this disparity is so large that it translates to the theme that we have today in proliferation, which is an inauthenticity of Indigenous interaction with the Westerner interested in those traditions and the sacraments. To explain further, when we are not first authentic to ourselves, and I'm going to elaborate on this after I make the point, if we are not first completely authentic, which means completely whole, we will only ever attract into our field, based on the true Indigenous knowledge of oneness, we'll only ever attract into our field those of an equivalent inauthenticity from the what seems to be and portrays itself as to be non-colonized side of Indigenous. Directly associated with your inability to be whole, this is going to translate in a relationship that's skewed, but perhaps completely blind to you. So you feel that this Indigenous person is telling you, because of his exotic nature to you, you're seeing him as different. So therefore you're enamored with what he's offering. It could be fire and smoke and promise of oneness and everything else. This isn't how you find an Indigenous person. True Indigenous will not be available to be contacted through social media platforms, telephone numbers, or even outside of their true community. Now, I am talking from a very privileged position in terms of our authenticity. My realization prior to being deeply entrenched and immersed in my particular tradition, my relationship to myself was already whole. What do I mean by that? Whole, meaning not as an intellectual idea, but my realization of self, that I discovered self. Now, this is another whole conversation here. That means, for anyone that's wondering or wanting to see, that I know I am everything around me. Now, when you know that, instantly, all of the chasing, the seeking, the compulsions, the desires, the wants, they all disappear. Can we imagine that? So you are a silent vessel, seeing truly to those around you and to nature as yourself. Now, only from this position will someone assume the capacity to find themselves walking a path of interaction with deep authenticity, true Indigenous. Further explanation. True Indigenous do not sell their tradition. True Indigenous do not sell their tradition. Some people may investigate my words and say, we're doing that. But we are not. All money is considered donation and is even bureaucratically accepted as such through an NGO, non-for-profit organization. A true healer in my tradition of Bwiti, according to the Babongo tradition who originated it, and this Iboga, is for humanity. So a relationship of which I'm selling my tradition, I'm creating a divide between someone who wants to buy and someone who wants to sell. And that is controlling. You're now him and her, which creates division between people. That can't be real. So if anyone is selling their tradition or offering trips to go to their tradition or offering their sacrament for money without this entrenched reciprocity and return to the communities to protect those Indigenous communities from our Western psychology and Western way of life, there needs to be, by necessity, a divide from the Western world, because for the Indigenous to open up and sell their tradition is to spell complete destruction of anything that is whole, because true Indigenous knowledge is oneness, brotherhood of man. Iboga only exists in our case, for example, for you to transcend what is the illusion of separation from everything around you, to become one, and then turn your back upon any differences and see that you are ever still and unchanging in the face of eternal flux of what is God. These deep principles I'm displaying and talking about now, why I'm making a point of them, is because without them, we cannot access those Indigenous who can impart with us the necessary tools for us to learn this oneness of which I speak right now. Highly important. Highly important. So once again, the reminders are people, shaman who are living outside of their community, shaman in other traditions or anything else. In our case with the Bribri we have Awa, and in our case we have Ganga and Nima. If they're living outside of their community and they're selling their tradition, that is not a true healer, because the healer must be available for the community. The exception is if there is an Indigenous person, or like myself, in a communicative role of opening themselves up to be the bridge between these two psychologies of which we talk. That healer is performing a particular role. He can live outside of his position within the community. But any true healer that is going to give you and impart a wholeness of complete healing on all facets, all levels of spiritual, physiological, and mental, that must come from a man who has his entire life donated to the development and knowledge of the Indigenous traditions, the cultural expression through the sensing of plants and the application of plants for medicine. This takes sometimes, say in my tradition, 30 years or 40 years in the Bribri tradition as well, to even begin to be in this position of wholeness that's capable of healing all things or all ailments. So to circle back quickly, we would like to make authentic connections, and the signals for those will be people, number one, talking about these sorts of things, the wholeness of things and your sovereignty. If the person is selling and is not mentioning to you or anything about oneness, brotherhood of man, your connection to God, well, this is a business, right? This is very different. My messages here are really to assist those from the West. For me, this was an easy assimilation because of how I was born and how I was wired. I have been this identity well before I understood I was it. And it's been very easy for me. I have more of an indigenous psychology of wholeness. So it's very easy. This is why I'm in a duty of care through my king, in my position to be a bridge to those who would like to wade themselves out of the prolific world of materialism. You see, the other thing we must consider, the responsibility firmly lies, if we'd like to protect Indigenous relations, and we're seeking Indigenous relation and connection, the responsibility first lies upon the Westerner. Why? Let me explain this very interesting dynamic that people do not see or understand. Firstly, as a Westerner, if I look at me, for example, I grew up in an environment of materials. The moment I was born, I was indoctrinated. I was given a birth certificate. My birth was taken control of. My mother was given vaccines. I was given vaccines. Then I was given an indoctrinated diet based on American advertisement and ideas of industry. 50s type relationships with people. You know, eat this margarine, eat this food, television, cartoons, right? Interactions, fighting, drinking, arguing, war. And then the promise of riches, wealth, money, cars, complete control, complete immersion without knowing that they have an authority of God inside, complete delivery. For the Westerner who can wade himself through that and become, say in my position, which I'm proud of, I have renounced all of those things. They mean nothing. I have no result in those. They do not even touch me. I do not acknowledge. So I've come through and waded through that materialism into what is, and be considered from the West, as a monastic way of life with a whole sense of oneness and community. Now, that movement of a Westerner allows him to understand his own psychology and to take care of the harmonious one of which he speaks. Because the Indigenous psychology is already whole, less materially influenced, already living ideas and rhythms of harmony, brotherhood of man, peace, love, grace, medicine, connection, love. They are whole, you see. So the Western man who comes from the broken, fragmentary world of control and becomes whole has a very big responsibility to protect the wholeness of which he's approaching. Because that, on the other side, if you look at this, if what's happening with these inauthentic relationships, the Indigenous man is being tempted by the promise of money and wealth. So can you imagine the Indigenous man coming from wholeness is being coaxed into the world of broken fragments? You see the two movements? The Western who comes through is in a powerful, responsible role of being a bridge to talk, such as I am doing online, to make sure that these relationships are understood and that we can look after these people who are the last bastions and stewards and guardians on the planet, the last ones who hold harmony in their mind and their being. It does not exist in the Western world. It does not exist. There is no harmony. There's zero. There's broken relations, illusion, all complete. The responsibility that we have as Westerners when we're reaching out to the Indigenous is immense. They're instantly tainted by promise from you when you want something. You want something from them, or they're sacred, or their money, or they're offering, and you think, well, they're offering, I'm helping them. No, you're not helping them that way. If you'd like to know how to help Indigenous, you come in quietly. You seek the people that aren't selling their tradition. Then there's no tainting or corruption of relationship. You sit down and you share. This is the way you learn with Indigenous. And I've been around this for a good majority of my life. If you'd like to learn, you sit quietly and you answer when you're asked something. You don't present ideas of Instagram, materials, lollies, chocolates. You do not do that. This is a Western colonized way of interacting with Indigenous. You see it in places like Peru all the time, people giving candies to children and things. It's like feeding monkeys. It's very condescending. You see, this is not how you do things if you want to maintain Indigenous relationships. You come in very gently and sit down. When asked something, you answer. When given food, you say yes. They're trying to learn you. When you don't respond well to a food they offer, they may laugh because they're thinking that's different. Doesn't mean it's bad. It means they're watching every little change, every difference. That's what they're looking for, because they'd like to assimilate you into their whole field. They'd like to accept you and love you, right? We need to be very mindful. And I know that people that steer towards our direction are obviously already having this thought. But my motivation here is to protect, sustain, and preserve those traditions, because soon there will be none. We need to align ourselves with the principle of reconciliation of God in self in our tradition in Butu, so we can become one and bring that guardianship, that stewardship of wholeness and nature into the Western field. First, the relationships between the two must be understood, because the authentic Indigenous and the Western world couldn't be more upside down and opposite from one another. There requires a bridge and a development of you as a self. So all I could say is, people out there, that when you're looking to go to Indigenous people, please be careful. Please be gentle. Please be mindful of the differences that you purvey, the attractions, the materials, the money, the different idea, the shoes you wear, the clothes. These are all influencing these people. And it all comes at the cost sometimes, because we want to have a plant medicine and tell the world that I went to an exotic tribe. You might as well wear a pith helmet and, go hunting in the safari. It's very colonized. We need to understand that. So hopefully my message reaches a few people. I'd like people to understand. And of late, this also a quick point. We have obviously a proliferation of people making documentaries and films about Indigenous peoples. And this is very common now. Now, these people will say that they go to Indigenous places and that they do this and that. But I'm telling you now that no true Indigenous message is going to be allowing a random film of Westerners who aren't yet whole in on what really goes on in their tradition. These people are under the impression, when they pronounce these movies through the West, that they've received something authentic. They've received a part of the Indigenous message to do with humanity, because that's what the Indigenous will do. They're using the platform to make sure that we're trying to get harmony. But do we detect a point of arrogance here? That somehow the Westerner feels that it has a mission to make a film about people that it knows nothing about, in an effort to save a people. Now, let me explain something. That is not a whole person contacting an Indigenous. To go right back to how I began. That's a person who has an agenda to get a message across via itself, to save itself. This is a corrupt relationship, whether it sees it or not. These people might say, oh no, this is what I want Mother Nature and all this stuff. Says who? That's not the person that nature, and there's nothing wrong with nature. There's nothing wrong with humanity. It's an illusion that you feel you're wrong. This is about awakening inside in consciousness. To want to create a film to save Indigenous is colonizing. Unless you're coming in and you're making a film or a documentary or a message for Indigenous by letting them have their complete voice and talking exactly these direct things from deep knowledge, not from people who are you're accessing because of your inauthenticity and your lack of development of self. You're attracting those who aren't capable of giving exactly what we need for humanity. You're attracting Indigenous who aren't completely developed, but rather looking out of their own agenda. If we have our own agenda, we are falling victim to the illusion already that we're being controlled by something other than our Godhead. Listen to that. So the person that says, I'm going to make a film about Indigenous, if they're asking someone like me and a shaman and they can handle it, or a healer, whatever you want to call me, I would say to them, why? Why do you want to make that? And they'll say, oh, well, I want to get the message across. And I say, hang on, listen to me further. There's nothing going on until you say it. You're following an illusion. The true motivation to make a film is to create harmony and make a message. But at the end of the day, a film is not creating harmony. It creates a divide. So you make a film about Indigenous and then sell it. People are seeing the Indigenous as separate from themselves, and that someone else had the power of making the film. And that doesn't correct the relationship of wholeness. It makes more division. You have to really explore what I'm saying there. Essentially, what I'll say on a deeper humane response from the Spirit is, who thinks they have the right to speak on behalf of anyone else and help anyone else? Who has such a right? True Indigenous are waiting for you to help yourself. Not you coming and saying, I'll get your message out there. That's a skewed relationship. You're not understanding. They need you to come in and give everything to them to allow them have their peace of mind and their way of life. That's all. Then you can start to learn something about relationships. But knowing that you're truly whole would mean that you wouldn't make a film. So the person who's going to make a film or do anything else on behalf of Indigenous, you're not whole. So how can you speak a whole message of harmony? It's broken. Well intended, not good enough. So this is the thing. We need wholeness, we need love, and we need connection. We need preservation and sustainability. That means uplifting the Indigenous voice to allow them to have their way of life, which is to be free of the monetary needs, to have their land, and to have their message and medicine. So hopefully this helps a little bit with anyone that's interested. And just remember, when we're self-realized and we understand ourselves, there's nothing we need to do. The world, to react to the world is your problem. You're creating it. The world is you. That's what we're saying as Indigenous. So trying to do something for someone else is acting like the world isn't you. So we need to be very mindful. I'm giving you Indigenous perspectives here. So the people that do find these outlets to talk about in their documentaries and everything else have not found authenticity. They've found pale views of such, because deep Indigenous message is not available to an outside community member or initiate. Just remember that. You can't go and find out things about Bree Indians here other than surface. You can't find anything about our tradition other than surface. You can't find anything about Chavin in Peru without surface. You can't find anything. You'll only get a message that actually is able to be given to you and then put outside. The best way for everyone to approach Indigenous is to stop the self-agendas, to pick up wholeness in the mind and realize they're one with all things, and to go and sit with those Indigenous without the feel that we need to somehow do something for them, but rather show them that we are developing and working in with what they need, which is you to be harmonious with self. So thank you very much. Tovavo.